Serious Redditors who have survived a plane crash. How did people react on the way down? I was in a helicopter crash. Everyone was silent during the ordeal other than the pilot, who was like, everything is fine. Fuck. Shit. Fuck. Nope, it's okay. Fuck. Look for the lake to ditch. We were coming down from a mountain cabin flying by sight when fog rolled in. The pilot started swaying left and right to find something to get a bearing in the whiteout, and he found something. The trees. I will never forget going from total dizzying whiteness to cedar tree branches pressed up against the plexi wood now. The sound of chop chop chop. The smell of Christmas. Smelled like fresh cut Christmas tree, I swear. And then the loudest horn ever, and a big red light on the dash that said stall. I was in co-pilot seat. Somehow we managed to spot a rock by the lake and the pilot slammed it down hard, but amazingly nobody hurt, and the smoke from the engine never turned to flame. We were damn lucky, and that pilot didn't fly in BC again. He flew power lines in AB after that, where one doesn't have sudden whiteouts. I'm pretty late to this party, but here it goes. I was pretty young, only about 4 or 5, when I was in a plane crash. It was a small one-engine prop plane with just me, my dad, and the pilot, who was a family friend. It was caused by engine failure. I don't remember much except my dad's actions. He was sitting in the front co-pilot seat. He reached back to me in the back seat and pulled my winter coat snug around me. It was winter in Cleveland, Ohio. Then he made sure my seatbelt was fastened securely. After making sure I was safe, he buckled himself in tightly as well. It is important to note at this point that my dad is a devout Christian. He recounted his perspective to me when I got older and said that he was certain he was going to die. He said that he was quiet and praying that God would allow his son to live, even if he didn't. Both my dad and the pilot were knocked unconscious on impact, and both severely injured. Dad regained consciousness first and heard me crying in the back of the plane. He told me that his first thoughts were a mix of panic and relief. He panicked, thinking the pilot was probably dead and he has to get out of the wreckage, but he has some relief because my crying meant I was alive. In the end, all 3 of us bet the odds and survived. I was flying to Iraq and the C-5 caught fire. Some electrical problem and smoke started to fill the cabin. A C-5 is a huge bird, and it's also weird because you fly facing the back. So the cabin is filling with smoke and we are somewhere over the ocean. The whole time I'm thinking we have tons of weight in war machines in the belly, and if we hit water we are sinking immediately. Some Air Force guys are walking around the cabin and tell us to reach in the pocket in front of us to grab the oxygen bags. I was expecting a yellow cup that resembled a muzzle, but I pull out a red bag with an elastic band around the neck area. I place it over my head and pull the string, then my eyes start burning like hell. As far as the reaction from us soldiers, we were in the 82nd Airborne Infantry, so we were used to jumping out of airplanes and wanted parachutes. But obviously they didn't have that many. We were all pretty calm, this being our second deployment, the first to Afghanistan no more than 2 months prior. We were all pretty much expecting death at any moment, and were joking around. I think a few of the guys were playing keep away with the airbags. We ended up making an emergency landing in Spain at an Air Force base, and had to stay for 3 days while they repaired the bird. The entire time we were on lockdown, because the Air Force didn't trust infantry soldiers from the 82nd lol. I finally get to tell this story. I was flying with a friend in northern Minnesota, and had to make an emergency landing in a field. It was windy, and as he was making, the decent gusty wind screwed him up, and came down angled. When we came down, he cut his face on the console stick, and was out of it. I was fine, got out of the plane, pulled my friend out, and we grabbed the go back from the storage area. Tried our cell phones, but his had a cracked screen. Bad, and mine got no service. He had called on the radio before the crash, and had told the emergency services guy that we were making an emergency landing. I got on the radio and called that we just crashed, and my friend was hurt badly. National Guardsmen had to come get us. I wasn't so scared when he told me that we would have to make a landing, but was nervous. I had the jitters, and had my eyes on my feet the whole time. When he told me the wind was too strong, I got scared. He couldn't get the nose back up and told me to brace. I had my hands on both sides of the plane. It was tandem style seating and started praying. Okay. That's all my only passenger said after I told him I'd be forced to land a Cessna 172 on a freeway at 9 p.m. He then said nothing at all, and I'm fairly certain I shat far more bricks than he did. Plane didn't crash, but I sure as hell thought it was going to. I was flying back from Colorado back home to New Jersey. Plane started to descend quickly in the middle of the flight. Everyone looks around confused. Flight attendant is talking to someone on the phone /PA. System then immediately sprints to her seat and buckles in. Oxygen masks drop down. More confusion. Then everyone freaks out and puts the masks on. Plane is still dropping quickly. I look around to see kids are crying. I see an older couple holding hands and a man listening to something on his headphones. Apparently there is a channel on the radio where you can listen in on the captain's radio. I'll listen in and hear the captain refer to all of us as 100-something souls on board. I think that was the scariest part for some reason. I'm sure it's normal to refer to people as souls, but in that context it was haunting. Ended up having to emergency land in Chicago. Never found out why the plane malfunctioned, but we all got free drinks on the next flight. I was in an almost plane crash on a flight from Newark to Istanbul. Something didn't feel right as we were boarding, but I think because the flight next to us had just been cancelled, they got us on board and hoped for the best. In about 5 hours over the Atlantic Ocean, something seems off. Then the pilot comes on saying there is a mechanical issue and they are not sure what's going on, but to prepare for a water landing. Everyone is confused, and it was dead quiet. It was also nighttime, so some people were asleep. Flight attendants start wandering the aisles more and more frequently, making us more worried, since we had no idea what was going on, and we didn't hear from the captain. A few minutes later, the captain comes on and says there is a problem with the engine and they are turning around and going to attempt to make it back to land. Meanwhile, the flight attendants are rushing back and forth and trying to get people to look at the safety instructions. By this point, everyone is awake, as far as I can tell. According to people I talked to afterwards, one flight attendant went and sat down and put her face in her arms. Another one apparently told someone that people don't usually survive water landings. It was just me and my mom. And the whole time I kept thinking about my little sister and how she was going to have to grow up without a mom. It was pretty terrifying, but you would be amazed at how quiet the cabin was. After the worst turbulence I ever felt in my life, and the most silence I have ever experienced, we were able to make an emergency landing in Newfoundland. And that's the story of the first and only time I've ever been to Canada. I was in a commercial jet that fell from cruising altitude. It was a small jet flying on a now defunct airline. We had just started the descent when the plane tilted and it dropped out of the sky. Nose was pointed nearly straight down. I was sitting in the aisle. People were screaming, yelling out, but I can't remember the words. All kinds of crap was flying through the cabin and the flight attendant was nowhere to be seen. My brother and dad were in the seats behind me. I remember thinking about how sad my mom was going to be, and then looking out at the window at the ground. After what seemed like an eternity, the pilot was able to regain control, and the plane started to right itself again. For about 15 to 30 seconds, before starting another uncontrolled descent. It was more terrifying the second time around. The ground was far closer. I was certain that I was going to die, and looked over at a blonde woman about my age sitting next to me. We hadn't spoken the entire flight, but I reached out in some impulsive desire for human contact at the end. And we held hands as the plane fell out of the sky. I can remember looking at her face briefly. She was crying. As the ground started approaching, and you could make out things like trees and houses, I felt a sense of peace fall about me. Death seemed to be certain, but I didn't care. It seemed like it was going to be quick and painless, but I remember being surprised that it was going to all end this way. Then we started to feel the pilot struggling with the plane, and it started to right itself again. And for a second time the plane pulled out of the dive. It was still incredibly bumpy and people were crying and screaming out at every round of turbulence. Everyone was waiting for the next and final dive. When we landed, the young woman and I were still holding hands. People were dead quiet. What was surreal was that the flight attendant got on the microphone when we reached the gate and thanked us for flying on that shitty ass airline and hoped we would fly again. They brought a bus out and one of the pilots came out with us. He didn't say a word, but his knee was shaking uncontrollably. To explicitly answer your question, Ob, some people scream and panic in those last few minutes. Others seem to accept the inevitable. In the moment it seems like there isn't much that you can do. It's all in the pilot's hands. I hate flying now. An emergency landing. I was on a Southwest flight landing in Minneapolis. First thing that tipped me off that something was wrong was when I checked my phone and we were 20 minutes late and hadn't started our descent, nor had we received an announcement from the cockpit. There was nothing I could do, so I went back to reading my book. A few minutes later I saw something I had never seen before and hope to never see again. The steward came running to the back of the plane where I was sitting at full speed with a look of panic on his face. A minute later the steward announced that our flaps wouldn't extend and that we would have to make our emergency landing in Min. After that we burned off some fuel. While we burned off fuel they had safety briefings for those in emergency rows. Since I was in the very back of the plane and had an aisle seat I would be responsible for opening the right hand door while the steward handled the left hand door. I had time to get a signal and text my wife. Most everyone else was doing the same. It was quiet in the plane. No one freaked out or panicked. During the landing they had us brace in crash positions. As for the landing itself, it was the smoothest landing I've ever had. The captain was a real pro and put the plane down with the lightest touch, even though he was way above his normal landing speed. On the way off the plane I saw him in the cockpit. He was soaked in sweat and you could tell he was physically and mentally exhausted. I think it was then that it sunk in for me just how much danger we really had been in. My landing made the evening news, and I saw it on TV that night in my hotel room. Funny thing was a few months later I received a letter from Southwest denying any emergency took place on that flight.